And good morrow. Well, welcome to the channel today. It's not much of a channel. If you're coming here, I doubt it's because you're a repeat viewer. Certainly the quality of the presentation here is, I would argue, B grade versus what you can find around the internet. Arguably the content of the information, hopefully just as valid or as viable as any other information you might find on the internet. I'm probably just as qualified a person as to feel that they've got something to share, to come here and to share it. Today's video, though, is it's a Sunday where I live. It's meant to be the peaceful day where potentially I was just going to play this game for a few hours. And upon startup, I came across quite a few problems. And because they're related to the videos I've done over the last 3 days, where I've used Windows Gamebar for recording game capture, and then a whole bunch of system errors or issues has come about since using that software. So if the heading of this video is "Do not use Windows Gamebar," which is pretty likely to be what it will go with, or something along those lines, this here is just a quick little Sunday showcasing for me to describe some of the pains in an attempt to fix the issue and what steps I might have gone through and just what I was experiencing. And I'll keep the talking fairly short. I'll just leave the video to run. This actual footage is just for my own personal use. Sadly, the frame rate counter isn't usable, and that's just ever since I installed turned on the Gamebar. Oh my lord, all the troubleshooting errors and issues that I went through steps, and at the end of it, yeah, I've lost my beautiful pristine setup, where everything on the bottom of my screen, the measuring tools in a range of colours. I've tweaked it back to basically how it was, but I'm not getting a frame rate counter at the moment. That's fine. It's better than the alternative, which is how things were working. It's taken me about 4 hours this morning to get to this stage. The stage, there's an old saying that the keys are in the last place I looked. And the joke of that is, of course, that after you find your keys, you don't go on looking for them. You're not going to go and look in 3 other places and say, oh, they were in the 4th last place I looked. I would say, when I was troubleshooting this morning, that I was up to the very last thing I was willing to do before doing a full Windows reinstall. Now that is very telling. And this is someone who spent a lot of time in the registry editor this morning and removed references to certain software to stop it from starting. Look, I could see that was not happening. And all the internet guides for how to physically remove the software packages from the machine, none of them worked. And that was a command line key that it was pretty evident through internet searches that Microsoft has changed the command line. The ways to remove the software has changed over different iterations of Windows 10 and even into Windows 11. Look, it definitely is. So let's just take this back a step. Right? If it's a Sunday for you and you're just casually listening to me talk, you might want to learn something about my opinion. Right? Now, it's just my opinion. You can tell me that the facts I try to tell you are wrong. You can say, oh, factually, that's incorrect. When it comes to opinions, it's an old saying, everyone's allowed to have one. Like articles, everyone's got one. I've got an opinion. I've got an opinion that Microsoft isn't very good for gaming. Gaming is one of the world's most profitable industries. They figured this out come the 2000s. Right? So every business, any business that actually has shareholders, basically had to start targeting gaming. And ever since Microsoft has come to gaming, all the most unethical things has happened in the gaming world. It started off with good old Xbox One. The hardware had an N-Force chipset, which had a built-in Dolby Digital encoder. Now, if you were gaming at the time, the title FIFA on Nintendo 64 supported Dolby Surround. Need for Speed on 3DO and various PlayStation iterations of a lot of games had Dolby Surround. But Dolby Digital encoding, that was a game changer, right? Because PCs could do that. Microsoft changed the audio stack when it went to Vista and just killed 99% of all sound cards being hardware, just overnight, gone. And the PC market never bounced back from that. We've never really had good audio in the PC space since then. Everyone's quite happy to use a USB sound card now. Look, if you've ever heard what Oriole A3D2 could do, and what Half-Life sounded like with wave tracing and occlusion, something that the PlayStation 5 now does natively. I think it's the only hardware really out there that does. Got the Tempest audio engine, and with the new beta software for the firmware on that, you can actually render Tempest sound, right? So there's a lot of people like What Hi-Fi and all these professional websites are just pretending that Tempest is like another codec, and that Sony didn't want to pay the piper and decided to use a non-industry standard. Well, that's completely not the truth. Right? The Tempest audio engine is actually amazing. It's like light sourcing or path sourcing of light, but with sound waves, right? So it factors the surface that a sound wave hits, and then if that surface obfuscates the sound or sharpens the sound, like in the way that carpet can make sound diffuse, and will take further bounces of the sound, will nullify them quite quickly. They have this going on at a hardware level. We actually had this back in the 90s with a thing called Oriole A3D. Fiercely competitive against the Sound Blaster Creative EAX extensions, environmental audio extensions. And A3D was vastly the superior product. When A3D2 came to market, it was based off US military helicopter simulations, so that the pilots in those could actually, when simulating a helicopter through valleys, they could, using audio sourcing, pick up the incoming sound of another helicopter, right? Because radar won't work below a certain height with these mountains, certainly back in the 90s. Anyway, Tempest, Oriole A3D was amazing. And Creative had a big issue with that. And so Creative fought them, lost their lawsuit. But unfortunately, Oriole had gone bankrupt trying to fight Creative. And so even though they won the lawsuit, they were actually in a position on the market where Creative could then come in and buy them out. And as happens when you buy out a company that you have a lawsuit against, sometimes you don't really have to pay the money you owe them. Let's just say it worked in Creative's favour. But Creative didn't want to have to reiterate their hardware. They were quite happy with the the 1000 chip, the EMU, I forget what it was, had 1000 MIPS of processing. the Sound Blaster Lives, the hardware versions of them, not the software versions. The actual sound chip claimed it had like 1000 MIPS of processing, and it could create echo effects. It created echo effects on multiple environments. I think once you got up to EAX, Environmental Audio Extensions version 3, you could actually have sound pass through one environment into another environment and have different echoes attached to that sound as it travelled through those environments. But all the same, the later versions of OpenAL, which is what we all had to move to once Vista came about and everyone, Daniel K and whoever hoodwinked making the old software methods of sound, they made it so that you could pass your hardware sound cards in ways that they would actually work through the hardware abstraction layer, and you could actually use the hardware. And only took a minute to do. Creative were going to sue Daniel K and realised they had to look like the right bastards, and they just pretended like, oh yeah, we're working with him. Yeah, it's really good that, shaking their heads while saying affirmatively and nodding. Yeah, we're really happy that all those old sound cards that you bought from us now work. We can't just all sell all new sound cards now that Vista's come out. But this is the way the market goes. Commercial businesses try to turn a profit. And at the end of the day, because Microsoft didn't want PCs to have features that their gaming console had, hardware sound is when you was basically taken away, right? And so Creative never returned Oriole A3D to the market. There was some fake versions in OpenAL which would kind of support it, but it was fair to say Creative never evolved or worked with this technology they brought out. And until the PS Vita came out, until PlayStation, the first VR, had aspects of the similar hardware sound built into the VR box that went between your console and the TV. And I think the later Creative Pulse headwear might have had some of that hardware built into it in such a way that the PS4, when paired with the Creative Pulse headwear, would get some of the benefits of it. But with the PS5, it's many, many times more powerful than it was in the PSVR, which was actually more powerful than the version that was in the PS Vita. And the version of the PS Vita was just perfect. If you played Killzone Mercenary on a PS Vita, it was the first time in over a decade that something like the original Half-Life had done, or the original Thief games, that it just started a whole new gaming genre. Thief, walking on carpet made it sound diffuse. Walking on cobblestones was loud. You learnt to fire noisy arrows into the corner of the room to make the guards run off and go and check that out. This notion of games built on audio concepts actually took off in much the same way that you could redesign a game from the ground up for VR to use interactive controls, or things benefit when you design from the ground up to use a certain feature. And in the late 90s / early 2000s, audio had really come into its own in the PC space. And then it just stagnated until, things like the PS Vita came along, and Killzone Mercenary running a low little 5-watt processor, which was also the screen. And, it was amazing. As a human being who wants to acknowledge aspects of excellence, what the PlayStation Vita could do on a low little, essentially like a phone chiplet, and with a pathetic little power envelope, it was just incredible. And, Killzone Mercenary looked much akin to Battlefield running on a Ninja PC at the time. Now, it wasn't entirely true. Battlefield had completely destructible environments. The PlayStation was playing its strongest card, which is suspension of disbelief, making you feel like the environments you're in were just as interactive. You never had more than 8 enemies on screen at once, but there was clever ways they could stream them in on you. You killed that guy, and okay, another one starts running around the corner instantly. You know, it's like, yeah, we only got 8 actors in this movie, but we'll just keep changing the makeup. We'll be right. And yeah, the PSV, a very incredible piece of hardware, but it was the start of the return of hardware sound. So that's a really good thing. Anyway, my rant and rave about Microsoft in the industry of computing. For a long time, it's had a very failing console ecosystem. For over a decade now, they've been losing money annually, trying to get the hardware out there. And they know that when they win the war, right, eventually, if you can get an Xbox in everyone's house, people buying software for that console will generate your money. People paying network costs annually will generate your money. Licensed peripheral sales, including solid-state drives that you have to buy for that hardware alone, unlike the competitors' ecosystem, which you can use any drive you want, right? All of these things, these licensing of hardware that Microsoft get, generate some money. That's the 3 pillars of income. When you have a console platform, you're quite willing to lose money on the hardware to get it into people's houses, so long as forevermore you get a little bit of money from all hardware, from all software sold, your annual licensing costs, and peripherals, licensed peripheral sales. So Microsoft doesn't really get any of that, right? Because they're losing the war. They got Games Pass, they're just giving all their games away for free. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. For over a decade now, Microsoft's been making some exceptionally bad business decisions. And so what it came down to when they were really losing the war against the PlayStation is they started to obfuscate their numbers of units in the market so that developers would at least believe if they developed a game for an Xbox ecosystem that they might actually be able to sell the software. And so in order for Microsoft to do that, they started deprecating our production platform, Windows, as a PC operating system. So if you had computer hardware and you can't sell it by law without having an operating system on it, Microsoft has done a lot of unethical things over the years. For example, before we had Chromebooks, we actually had Linux. Started to come to market, right? But the last thing Microsoft wants is for all the cheaper people, right? So that the cheapest of netbooks, when they first came to market, they weren't running a full fat version of Windows. They were running a version of Linux. And I think Microsoft quickly realized that if all the students on the planet and if all the people in areas of the planet that buy cheap equipment, if they all cut their teeth on Linux, right? You're not going to transition from Linux, which is stable, it's secure and rock solid reliable and absolutely incredible for productivity, right? If you've got a platform that's that good, and then you go to a platform that's janky as and gives you none of the effectiveness of the hardware that you're buying, right? You don't transition that way. Transition away from Windows to anything else, right? Any competition to a Microsoft product is always the better option. Okay, I say this as someone who's been supporting Microsoft products since before the 90s, right? When Microsoft was it was a graphical user interface. It wasn't an operating system, right? You ran your MS-DOS 3, and then you loaded, if you wanted to, a graphical user interface. You basically just did it to show off your hardware at the time. Look, I got so much power, I can waste it all rendering this really heavy overlay. And it's just doing everything really slow. Like if you're like myself and you prefer to command line, you could copy files a lot quicker into target directories and whatnot. You just did that. You know, you didn't muck around with a graphical user interface. It really was just to so your aunt could use a computer, I guess. So the family members could really like. I mean, the old joke was Windows 95 equals Mac 84, Mac OS 84. They've always played the catch-up game, but whenever there's a competitor's product to a Microsoft product, you just take it. Anyway, I'm tangenting. Microsoft needed to up the perceived number of installed platforms they had for gaming on. So they started calling Win 10 licenses Xbox consoles. Right? They could do that on the basis that there was some Xbox software on the Windows platform. And this is relevant to my talk today because it was activating that Xbox software that absolutely broke my computer and limited my frame rate by more than, took us just a cap of 30%, just gone in the worst case scenarios, but it definitely cut my power limit down by about 10%. It cut my frame rate down by 10%. It created a screen flicker, all this sort of stuff. Oh, that's all the Xbox software, right? And it's there on purpose because, right, what they do is they really needed PCs to count as Xboxes to convince developers, look, if you build software for us, you might be able to sell it. That's a fair logical argument. And those slides are, really, really handy at a boardroom level to convince people. Look, statistically speaking, look at this, right? If you buy from us, this is the number of people you might be able to sell your software to. They did some dirty things around this time. They kept having Win 10 glitch. If you were running Win 7 and you said, no, I don't want Win 10, it would install anyway for a lot of people. You got forced via auto updates, and every single time that happened, that was another Xbox install. Right? These accidents were totally working in their favor because it's generating these fake numbers of how many Xboxes are out there. And they didn't go, oh, you've installed Windows 10 3 times now, and go, oh, that's one Xbox. No, that's 3 Xboxes, right? 3 Xboxes. And any time you were downloading, right, Windows software, right? So if I put Forza on my machine, there was one time where I had to re-download a 100-gigabyte game 3 times in a week. Right? Forced updates, no backups, none of that sort of stuff. 100 gigabytes 3 times in a week. Right? At the time, I was going through a mobile phone for my data. I can't say it was costly. That's not the point of today's discussion. I don't want you to think I have a bugbear against Microsoft because they've cost me money, right? But it is true, after Windows 10 came out, after about 6 to 8 months, I shut my PC business down. I no longer supported my local economy, if you will, because it was an unethical product. I could finish servicing a client's machine and they'd drop it off 50 kilometers out in the country. And then Windows auto updates would break their networking hardware, so I couldn't even remote log in and fix the issues. And the cost of these pensioners having me come out on such a regular basis, and I just stopped charging. And after months of not charging for Windows issues, and months of not being able to hit my typical turnaround deadlines because a machine would require sitting on a bench for a whole week checking for updates. That was Win 10. But it generated a lot of Xbox Live contact hours. As I say, a 300 gigabyte download of Forza Horizon 3 in the first week of January after the game had been out for a month or two. It was a bad time. Actually, a Russian version of the software, it basically got hacked. And that version of the software runs really quickly and didn't, it's the better version of the software. It didn't have all the issues that the game had hoodwinked into it at the time to make the game run really poorly on a PC versus equivalent Xbox. Here's the thing, you couldn't buy that software for PC. I had to buy Forza for Xbox. Even though I wouldn't let one in my house, I wanted Forza Horizon 3. It was set in an area where I'd grown up. I'd driven some of the cars in that game around that area quite a lot in my lifetime. For me, it was everything. I just wanted to see Australian blue skies. I wanted to see Australian post letterboxes. Telstra is our telephone company, and payphone booths all the side of the road. All that stuff's been pulled out of the game. Well, after they stopped doing updates for the game, they pulled out all the stuff that made it iconically Australian. They're a bastard company. You can't even buy the game anymore. They don't want you buying it. It's a great game. They've got to sell you new versions of it. So, good old Horizon 3, and that generated a lot of Xbox Live contact time. But at the time, as a PC user, I could see what the strategy was in terms of force users. We said in Win 10 will be the last operating system ever, but we've sold so few Xboxes in the last 2 years. We can create Windows 11 again, force you to upgrade to it, and we'll just keep generating fake numbers in the hope that we can get developers to develop software on our ecosystem on the basis that they might be able to sell some of it to turn a profit. Anyway, everything is obfuscation. Everything is BS. So anyway, the last thing they want is for a PC to work well. Right? They know if they can create enough issues with your PC gaming experience, you'll move over to Xbox. I spent hundreds of hours supporting Horizon 3 when it came out. I would write tens of thousands of words weekly to their forums, getting users up and running. And I actually got banned for 245 years from the Microsoft forums. I was being too useful to too many people, and Microsoft just kept taking down my solutions, which are generally things like a glitched out Xbox Live interface, which would stop your game from being able to boot. It was things like there was a 10-minute boot time on startup because of the video drivers. Microsoft would remove your company's official display drivers and replace them with their own. And those drivers, for whatever reason, would have a 10-minute just delay on startup. But the game just wouldn't load, and then it would start to load, and then it would optimize for your PC, and then it's guaranteed that for 20 minutes you could not play that game. But on the console, you could hit start, and the game would even run in high dynamic range. Right? It was better on console. And they use some clever stuff like hoodwinking it to only use your primary CPU core for the minimum frame rate, and they would load it down in such a way that your minimum frame rate would suffer. And then on the day when they decided to let the game go truly multi-core, they pulled all the display and draw distances down in the game to match what the future Xbox console would be able to do, so that PC Ultra is never allowed to exceed what the consoles can do. Right? If you know this is a mantra in your mind, you'll actually understand why it is that PC graphics has not been improving over the last couple of years. Now, it's only as software companies are starting to realise that aligning with Microsoft is actually the worst thing they can do for sales, and the worst thing they can do for being a viable player in the market. The more companies that disengage from that, the more that are starting to find that they can go a bit crazy with the settings and make PC graphics look good. I think that's why we're finding a breakaway, that as of the last 6 months of this year, we're seeing software that has been developed for the next-gen consoles And because people are starting to lose their ties with Microsoft, we're actually starting to see PC software come to market that is actually pushing a bit above the console hardware. But all of that is my opinion. Those last couple of sentences there, I mean, what level of truth do I assign to that? 0.6, 0.7, I don't know. Is it a thing? Probably. But can't say either way, don't know for fact. What I do know for fact is that recording a high dynamic range desktop in Windows can be a bit tricky. The AMD tools by default don't work. So knowing full well that the Xbox Gamebar allowed HDR recording, I turned on a feature which I generally try to yank out as hard as possible and disable if I do a new PC build. Anyway, after turning that feature on, I could not turn that feature off. In fact, what's worse is it gave preference to that recording software, which was now running permanently in the background. Right? I found it through the resource monitor, not the task manager, but the resource monitor. I could see that there was a Windows systems process that was writing to the disk about 100 kilobytes a second. And when I changed the recording settings between high and standard, it dropped by about 25%. So it's my guess, I could be wrong. I will guess that the quality of a standard video recording clip and a high one, I'm going to guess is about a 25, but depending how you look at it, a 30% increase or a 25% decrease in recording quality, depending on what settings you use there. And, oh my Lord, just trying to pull it out, right? So what was happening is my software was no longer getting preference, which meant my overlay wouldn't really kick in. It would flicker. The screen would flicker like it was swapping between, it couldn't quite decide what software it needed to make in the foreground. Now, after disabling that software in so many different ways, and I'm talking regedit and whatnot, it still was not relinquishing that. I still had this flicker on the screen that was happening about 20 seconds on the pre-caching screen into this game. And you could see that it was just as the HDR was kicking in. It was definitely as Windows in the background was doing something to try and grab access to your screen and set this game up. And then it would just flicker. And what was worse is in the game, I could see that I was just permanently 10% capped. I could see that my power on the video card would never, it was 10% lower at max load. Everything about it, my GPU hotspot was staying 15 degrees lower than what I tuned it for, which at the moment you'll see is just baking itself, it's sitting at 110. I found the worst case scenario in the game, and only because all morning I've had an impossible time getting GPU hotspot above 95%, or GPU power usage above 200 watts, 201 watts. I've just come to this screen and I'm leaving it recording just for my own point of reference, because as I say, the next step for me is a Windows reinstall, and I just want to make sure that I can stably run things in a consistent manner. That's all I want from a computer. It's a tool. It should be a tool. It's not a toy. But if it is going to be a toy on a Sunday, I want to be able to use it. And as a Sunday, I lost all of my morning servicing hardware. Okay, so what ultimately worked? Well, a clean display driver install. But I'm not going to say that is the solution, because for myself, right, we don't really talk about Bruno, but one of the requirements of being Bruno is you're allowed to talk about Bruno. Right? The first rule of being in Fight Club, right? If you're in the Vanguard program where you get access to beta drivers, you're not allowed to talk about them. So because Bruno is on a new display driver branch, reinstalling display drivers might have had such sufficient changes in the back-end system of Windows that it actually made a fix that might not work for anybody else or any other time in history. So I'm not going to give that as a solution. I haven't done today's video as a solution video, arguably. But I can say as a warning, preemptive warning, do not use Windows Gamebar. Do not activate it. Do not turn it on once, because it is so, this little feelers went into my system so deep, and it would not relinquish. It did not want to let go of the fact that it could now permanently break my PC and permanently have my games run slower. And the difference between, I tuned my machine to run this game at my screen refresh rate that I'd set it to, and to have it run 10% slower than that for no reason whatsoever was quite frustrating. Right? But Microsoft know that if they can cause you enough downtime on your PC or cause you enough pulling out your hair time on a PC, that you'll do the same thing that the Forza forums were filled with, which was people saying, I'm just going to get an Xbox. It just works. Right? And those comments were all the time. Like 1 in 5 people who were getting frustrated with the PC version just went, look, I've bought it on Xbox. I'm just going to go buy an Xbox. Right? That's Microsoft's strategy. Make the PC platform of gaming so painful, so hasslesome to use, that people just prefer having a console in their lounge room. Now, of course, on ethics and ethics alone, even though the PlayStation 5 is better hardware, better ecosystem, on ethics alone, I would encourage people who want to game in a Nintendo and a PlayStation ecosystem. But now we're getting right into the realm of my opinion. We've swerved off the road of reality and fact, and we're now into subjective take. But if you're willing to support a company that is so willing to abuse your time and your personal, dare I say, integrity as a customer, to abuse you in a relationship that is Stockholm syndrome, if anything, that you're locked into, right? We need to disengage. We need to close down that relationship. So the fact that DirectX 12 is now getting wrapped into the Mac OS, I believe that the new M chipsets, the incredible amounts of parallel of the GPU power, it's probably only a matter of time before before Mac gaming really takes off. Although that being said, Linux in the market is growing by market share quite substantially for the first time basically ever. And Linux gaming, I mean, we've had older versions of DirectX under Linux for quite a while now. So it's only when we start getting into DirectX 12 titles that we start to have an issue. But DirectX 12 is a fake DirectX. Okay, it was somewhere around about DirectX 10 that we finally found out that our hardware and PCs was not being used to the metal, right? It was because they were releasing the new version of DirectX, and it was a little bit more to the metal. To the metal just means that your operating system can make calls on the actual physical hardware that accelerate those calls. And therefore, the hardware that you've paid to accelerate certain math features or certain calculations is to offset your CPU or to offset your PC from doing that. And Windows has never used a level of language with the graphics card that allowed using the hardware that you've paid for effectively. So somewhere around about DirectX 10, this was made candidly revealed to the world because the new version of DirectX was going to be a little bit more to the metal, right? So the last gen consoles all using AMD chipsets. And AMD's, nobody will ever say this to you. The sad thing is that 9 out of 10 people go down the path of NVIDIA. NVIDIA just costs more. They'll always release a part that's 10% quicker than the competitors, and some people are willing to pay a chunk more money to get this 10% speed gain annually. It's actually a fake way to spend money. So it's not an actual increase, because if you take the savings you'd get by buying the one down from top AMD card every single release, the amount of money you save actually allows you to buy an annual upgrade or an upgrade a lot more frequently, and that upgrade a lot more frequently will actually net you a lot more speed continually. And with the exception of a couple of things that NVIDIA has doubled down on, you could say their software support's fantastic, but that was a pathway that they committed to with an architecture called Fermi quite a long time ago, and they had mixed shader links. They had short shaders and long shaders, and they had to optimize every single piece of software on a per title basis. And that was a pathway they went down. It was going to give them an advantage at the time. They needed more shaders because the competitors' cards had more shaders, but they were short shaders. Consumers are easily hoodwinked. We're all yellow belt consumers. We were buying AMD cards at the time because their number of shaders sounded like they had 4 times more than the equivalent NVIDIA card. But the NVIDIA shaders were longer, and per hertz or per pass, they could actually do a heavier level of math, and they were more effective, arguably. But they needed to start encoding their games on a per title basis to say, okay, this requirement can get away with a short shader, this requirement will benefit from a long shader, and then they would assign on a per title basis. And so drivers needed to be optimized on a per driver basis. And it was a really interesting time in history, because at the time when you bought a new video card, you had so much more power to render the latest games than anybody on the last gen video cards. And so you never optimized your drivers for the latest cards, you optimized your drivers for the older games. They were the ones that needed it. The new cards, they could just brute force, right? They could just run through the game easily. But somewhere around this time, NVIDIA started getting this reputation for having fantastic drivers. Arguably, they were spending a lot more money on their driver teams to make this happen. But around about the NVIDIA 7 series, they started to use that to their advantage. So they were doing black box. You know, they bought physics up from the market and killed hardware physics, and they never really used that. They just let that get deprecated, using probably a poor library. The original physics hardware, when it was coded, was using some sort of an x32, an older system call. But if they'd ever rewritten the hardware, if they'd ever rewritten their library to access a newer, a more modern method, they could have shown numbers in software of physics quite a lot better looking than what they could show in physical hardware of physics. But when NVIDIA bought up physics from the market, they wanted a jargon. They wanted an edge. And so they kind of buried it. I think there might have been 1 or 2 generations of card where there was technically a physics accelerator type thing put in place. I mean, I had a laptop with an actual physics chip in it and a couple of NVIDIA 8800s in it. It was a $7,000 laptop, but it was amazing. But yeah, nobody bought a physics accelerator. Here we are, 20 years later, still with very limited physics in our machines. And it's because you can do some physics on the CPU, you can do some physics on the video card, but you actually kind of need them to be interactive with each other in order for there to be feedback physics in your world. And so at the time the physics accelerator came to market, it revolutionized everything because they made us quickly realize that our games will benefit. Just like you have a dedicated sound card, just like you have a dedicated graphics card. If you've got a dedicated physics card in your machine, you can do things with physics that at the time games were not doing. Still to this day, hasn't really happened. Now, I believe the PS5 chip, when it was modified, it's not full RDNA, and they went to Epic Games for input on the design of the hardware for the PS5 chip. And so there's a couple of things it does that the straight RDNA 2 that's in the Xbox hardware doesn't do. One of them is an early Z cull, which gets them about a 40% speed increase. Certainly RDNA 3, which is what sort of it became. RDNA 3 is sort of like what they were doing with the PlayStation chip. It's like that, hey, if it's not going to get rendered on the screen, just don't send that data down the pipeline. Save your bus, all that just bandwidth. And it's essentially with RDNA 3, it was worth about a 50% instruction per clock, like an uptick. It was worth about 50% more grunt. So it's fair to say that a PlayStation, just by its hardware nature, auto-optimizes software in a way that generally yields about 40% better than what the raw numbers say. And when the Xbox platform looks like it's 20% more powerful, in the real world, what we end up with is that PlayStation games are typically going to punch about 15% faster in a lot of bogged down locations in games that it's just due to lack of optimization. And the PlayStation will just burn through it because it won't be getting its buses bogged down with this data that doesn't need to be processed rendered to the last screen, the screen output. But look, there's many parts of the summit, and physics is what I was talking about just there. And NVIDIA, they toyed with physics. They've always been a very anti-competitive company. They spend a lot of money. 9 out of 10 people buy NVIDIA. No one will ever talk negatively about NVIDIA. The last couple of years, they've been building momentum because they've been doing a lot of stupid plays. A lot of dedicated NVIDIA users are gradually realizing, I don't really like this. A lot of people are starting to realize that the so-called bad news that AMD drivers were poor quality is just because NVIDIA was spending so much more money on their driver branches in development that you weren't comparing apples to apples. Now, AMD's changed its game in the last couple of years, has realized that, look, if we're going to be competitive, we've got to get the latest drivers written for our latest hardware. Right? They were very slow to that game. And so the last couple of years, they've really been a lot better product. But the video chips are in what is in all the consoles, essentially. So if any software programmer out there is writing software for a graphics card, it's going to be written for AMD. Why does that matter? Okay, well, this comes down to DirectX. DirectX 12, right, isn't really the thing we think it is, right? There was DirectX 11. That was a Microsoft product, was my understanding. But DirectX 12 came about because AMD had a to-the-metal application programming interface, Vulkan, right? And it was available. I think it runs on all platforms, maybe Linux, maybe Mac. And the only reason we game on Windows PCs is because of DirectX, right? If DirectX didn't lock us down to gaming on a Microsoft Windows installed PC, we could all be gaming on Linux on whatever we want. And same with Apple, and we could be playing these games, but we can't because of the API, the application programming interface, DirectX, is limited on the PC space. And certainly the latest version of DirectX 12, will only find it on a Windows PC. Again, Apple news, you might want to read that space, but this has been an interesting year for hardware. So DirectX 12, what happened? Okay, so AMD had Vulkan. They had their own API that everyone was going to write for. NVIDIA was freaking out. They're like, oh my God, we are going to need to have our own API. Otherwise, AMD is just going to pull away from us. Microsoft saw that both companies were weaponizing and that they were both going to have their own APIs. And went, hang on, we can't have this. In the same way that in the mid-90s when netbooks started selling Linux on them, and we just went, okay, we'll make half-price Windows installs available for really, really cheap hardware as long as it's got no solid-state drive in it, as long as it's got less than 2 gig of RAM. It can't be upgraded to more than 2 gig of RAM, ideally 1 gig of RAM sold and soldered chip, unupgradable, i.e. if you save money and only give us $50 for Windows and don't buy a full-fledged version, a $100 version of Windows, your PC is going to suck, right? And I was working in Officeworks at the time, and we had all these beautiful little netbooks that could be upgraded to 2 gig of RAM and had solid-state drives in them. And we just had to clear them out overnight because Microsoft's requirement in the market at that time in order to sell netbooks with Windows on them was that they gimped the requirements. So that GIMP being getting mediocre performance, they made these netbooks have to be subpar. They made them not be able to run. Solid-state drives made them epic. in the mid 90s, in the mid 2000s, sorry, when you had these little tiny power efficient computers that you could actually take to uni and they'd fit on the little table that you wanted to type on, and they were great. But Microsoft realised that it couldn't have people learning Linux, and so they went, okay, we'll just change up the way we do here. We said we weren't going to sell Windows XP anymore, but we'll now sell Windows XP. We'll sell on this hardware. It's the only way we get to keep the market. Well, the same thing happened with DirectX. They went, hang on, we can't have Vulkan, we can't have NVIDIA coming to market with their own API. We're going to incorporate Vulkan. We're going to make that the basis of DirectX 12. And we're going to take what's happening over there in the NVIDIA side of things. We're going to make that it's all in DirectX 12. And if you've got AMD or NVIDIA hardware, you'll just go down different pathways in DirectX, and that therefore both companies are supported in name only, really, by DirectX 12. But it's all very fake, right? So the biggest, Microsoft never really used any of the features of DirectX 12. DirectX 12, if you look at the first couple of years of introduction, all the developers who were writing for it just kept saying, look, there's something really wrong. We're not going to talk about it. We've approached Microsoft, nothing's happening. And from experience of having supported Microsoft and worked in their channels, yeah, that's the standard policy. And that's exactly what was going on. For about 2 or 3 years, it was all obfuscated. People couldn't realize one of the features of DirectX 12 was it was platform agnostic with your hardware, that you could have an NVIDIA and an AMD card in your machine, and you could run them in a dual compute mode, and it would benefit you. And there was an early demo that came out that actually supported that feature. But they just had to keep saying, oh, look, we don't want to talk about it. Something wrong with DirectX. It's not really doing what it wants to do. Microsoft uses very specific features in DirectX to own the market. One of those features is DirectX, you can actually store all of your textures as one large texture file. So ever since DirectX 12 came to market, that's been about the only feature of it that they've really doubled down. We can talk async compute, we can talk whatever else, but the reality is one large texture file. Okay, so the trick there, brilliant trick, you make every new game have a texture file 1 gigabyte bigger than the video RAM on video cards available on the market at the time, right? So the original Xbox was tuned to use 5 gig of VRAM. That's the Xbox One. The Xbox One X was tuned to use 9 gig of VRAM. Now, in the time period in the market where both those systems existed, video cards had either 4 gig of VRAM or 8 gig of VRAM. But by making your texture pool 1 gig bigger than what your video RAM is, that's the only way to really bottleneck a PC video card, right? If you run out of VRAM, right, you don't just lose a couple of frames a second, you lose like 30% before. You lose a significant amount of your frame rate instantly. And PCs had so much more power than a standard Xbox One. This was a really good strategy, right? So when I got Forza Horizon 3, I was running probably a 780, GTX 780 NVIDIA card with only 3 gig of VRAM. So the original build of Forza Horizon 3 would nowhere to lie, slap a giant red warning logo taking up a significant, well, not quite 1/9 of my screen, but the top of the screen would say low VRAM warning. And the game would use the full 3 gig of VRAM on that card, but it wouldn't vary. It wouldn't go up and down. They would just leave that warning slapped on my screen with no ability to cancel it, no ability to go into the menus and say deactivate. Right? It was to punish me as a PC gamer. But it was genius, right? When you looked into it, what they were doing is they would encrypt the textures. Encrypted, right? Bank level encryption, AES 256. There's nothing heavier on a computer. This is all my opinion. Nothing heavier on a computer to use for math on your processor than encryption and decryption. And so what they did is by making the texture file a gigabyte larger than anyone's video card, is they made it so your computer had to constantly decrypt a large texture file. Very, very maths intensive. And they placed that math requirement on the primary core, which was also the game was basically single core at the time. And they had the 2 most math intensive functions happening on the primary core in such a way that it would limit your frame rate. Very, very clever. I did a video back in the day on how to get around it. If you made the page file on your system huge, you could get around it. Now I had 64 gig of RAM, but there's an old Windows trick from the 90s, which is allocate 2.5 times your video RAM in system memory to be put aside in case anybody needs to access something on their video RAM that won't fit and that needs to be buffered and that needs to come from somewhere. Having that extra memory reserved in your RAM on the system made sense. But back then, video cards had 2 megabytes of RAM or 4 megabytes of RAM, and lopping off a little bit of your system RAM made sense. Now, the last time I investigated this, I had 2 video cards with 8 gig of RAM on them a piece, right? So 2.5 times 8 is 20 gig of VRAM times 2. And that's exactly what was happening, as my machine was trying to allocate 40 gig out of my 64 gig to be optimized for availability for my video cards, right? They had 8 gig of RAM each, right? There was no need ever for them to try and load more than 8 gig. But on the off chance it might be needed, they wouldn't need a full doubling, right? They wouldn't need the ability to replace all of their RAM in content times 2, right? They don't need that much. A little bit would have been helpful. But no, Windows sticks with this outdated rule of lop off 2.5 times your video RAM and optimize your system memory to preference having that RAM available. So I was actually getting system memory short errors. I was having my web browser shut down upon running Forza, right? This is the most intended crippling anyone can do to an operating system, right? And it's through clever things like encryption and clever things, and this is it, DirectX, storing all the textures as one large texture. And Microsoft have doubled down on that, right? The operating systems in their consoles allocate for VRAM 1 gig of VRAM more than typical PC hardware cards are sold with. It is a long-term strategy towards them being able to make sure they obtain very poor performance in terms of how well your hardware scales, right? If you've got hardware that's capable of 5 times what an Xbox console can do, you will not see double the capability. You will not see double the frame rate output. Anyway, it's been a bit of a rant and rave. Don't use Xbox. Don't use Microsoft tools whenever you don't need to. Whenever there's a competitor or Microsoft platform or product available, use it. I believe OBS, Open Broadcaster Software, is probably the better alternative to Gamebar, DVR, digital video recorder. But look, that's my today's video. It wasn't meant to be an educational one. Whether or not anyone gets any benefit from my little discussions, I don't know. If you've enjoyed me as essentially a podcast in the background, if my tone of voice has been particularly cheery and has put a smile on your day, even when I talk conspiracy theories and hardcore stuff that nobody else is talking about, well, that's my unique little outlet or take on things. But I do love to support people in their gaming. And so today's clip wasn't in terms of how to get things set up. I guess it is just a warning. I'd like to think my heading for the video clip meets that. But I don't like to get people's alarm bells going. I don't like to raise people's adrenaline for no reason whatsoever. I really am a pretty chill and relaxed person, and I like to assist people feeling that way. And the best way for you to feel chill and relaxed is to avoid spending time with Microsoft products. Anyway, well wishes with you and yours, and I'll catch you in the next exciting chapter.